I'm going to warn you right now that this is a sensitive topic. So if you're not ready for this conversation, it's probably best that you click off. Hey dolls, welcome back to my YouTube channel. If it's your first time here, welcome. And if it's not your first time, you already know I'm glad to see your face. As you can tell from today's title, like I said, this is going to be a touchy and juicy topic. So come with an open mind and open heart. Come ready for respectful conversation in the comments. But I do want to preface this by saying that I am specifically focusing on the church in America, in the United States. And I also am focusing on racial reconciliation between Black and white people, because at the end of the day, I am a Black woman in America, so I can only really speak to that experience. And I do feel like when we're talking about racial reconciliation, majority of the conversations boil down between Black and white. Not saying other ethnic groups don't deal with their own conversations of racial reconciliation, but I do think the bulk of the conversation boils down to reconciliation between white people and Black people. And so that's where I'm coming from today. However, if you don't fall into any of those people groups, or maybe you don't live in the United States, I feel like you can still get something from this video, and it's just good knowledge to have on top of maybe taking some of the points that I say and applying it to your own racial reconciliation conversations where you live and between the necessary people groups and so on and so forth. So as we know, the church in America has suffered from racial divide for as long as we can remember, ever since slavery in the 1800s, where it was societally and legally normal for Blacks and whites to worship separately, and Black people weren't even afforded the opportunity to read the whole Bible, but even still through their oppression, they were able to find some sort of solace in the faith that they were able to get through the materials that they had and just the power of the Holy Spirit. But that in and of itself, the history of the Black church is a whole nother video that if I'm welcome or I'm open to doing if you guys want to hear it from me. So just let me know in the comments if you do want to hear it. But also, as we can see throughout history, that same divide that happened in the 1800s and things like that has pretty much continued on through the Reconstruction era, through Jim Crow, through the Civil Rights Movement, and all of that, all the way up until today, really, when you think about it. And so when we think about reconciliation, I want to pinpoint what exactly does that mean. Like, reconciliation basically is to make amends and to return to friendly relations if they were ever there. And given the history between Blacks and whites in America, I can't say that the overarching collective of our relations between each other has necessarily been friendly. So in our case, it's to make amends and to get to a place of healthier discord, healthier interactions with each other, and to be able to move past the pain and the hurt of systematic oppression to a point where we can worship together, particularly in the church, or we could do life together if you're talking outside of the church, and just general racial reconciliation, and where the playing field is even when it comes to opportunities and inequity and equality and the whole shebang, because there's so many issues and so many levels to this that Black people deal with when it comes to systematic oppression. And we're just dealing with a system that was set up to basically make us fail at every turn. And despite that, we have risen, from the ashes. We have definitely accomplished a lot as a people group in every area, from healthcare to entertainment to politics to education to, economic status, the whole shebang. But even though we've accomplished a lot, the pain of our past and honestly, the pain of our today is still there and is still looming over our heads more often than not. And the reality of the situation is living life as a Black person in this world, particularly in this country, is something that cannot be escaped. You are constantly going to have to face some sort of systematic oppression, even if it's not the brunt of it, but it's going to be through institutionalism. It's going to be in your church. It's going to be in some way, shape, form, or fashion that you're going to deal with it, because we have to navigate life in these bodies. We can't get away from it. We can't escape it. And so when it comes to racial reconciliation in the church, like I said, the history of the divide has carried on throughout the generations and throughout the centuries. And to this day, we still see a lot of churches being segregated. As a matter of fact, a research study that was done, I think in 2019 or 2020, by 3 different guys throughout Duke University, Baylor University, and I believe the other one was a University of North Carolina, but I can't remember verbatim. But basically it was 3 like experts that were doing the research to see like how far has a church come when it comes to being a multiracial church, when it comes to integrating and doing life together and things like that. And in 2019, it's still a minority to see a truly integrated church. Only about 16% of churches in 2019 were truly multiracial. I don't know all the standards that they put in place in this study to determine what was multiracial or not, but I do know that they looked deeper than just, okay, do you have X amount of Black people in your church? Or do you have X amount of white people in your church or whatever? I think they were actually really looking at standards, like, do you incorporate certain cultural variations in your worship? You know, because typically how the Black church worships, for instance, compared to the white church, it's different. Like, we all know the difference. I, don't have to really break that down and give or take some exceptions, but also the culture surrounding the church, because our lives affect how we do church together as well. If you're faced with certain obstacles in life, you're faced with certain hardships, you're faced with certain joys and triumphs, or just cultural things that your people group tends to deal with, you're going to also be able to relate to that with each other in a church setting, because we're all kind of living that same life. I can relate to you without having to necessarily explain it. It's like what's understood doesn't have to be explained. And so with that relatability comes a deeper level of relationship in the church together. And so these people that were conducting the study, they were looking for that. I know that it was deeper than just, okay, you have so many white people or Black people in your church. They genuinely were looking to see, are you integrating across the board? Not just integrating bodies, but are you integrating culture? Are you integrating experiences? Are you genuinely trying to break the norm of like, okay, you're here, so we have the Black bodies in the church, but we're not going to reverence any of your, or incorporate any of your culture, any of, the things that you enjoy. Like, you're basically in the church, but you have to conform to the way that we do things. You have to fit into our boxes. You have to do things the way we do it. Otherwise, you're just not going to be a good fit here. And I think that study was very helpful to see, because honestly, it shows you that despite it going up by 10 percentage points over a span of, I believe, almost 20 years. So from 2000, I believe it was, and being 6% of churches being multiracial in 2000, it went up to 16% in 2019, which, okay, that's a 10% increase, but it's still the minority, which means that the other 84% of churches are primarily your white or your Black churches. You might see a sprinkle of other ethnicities in that church, but there's pretty much still the same. So in the study that was done by Mark Chaves, Michael Emerson, and Kevin Doherty, what they found is not only were only about 16% of churches truly multiracial, but out of that 16%, what they found was that mostly Black people were entering predominantly white spaces in church versus white people entering predominantly Black spaces in church. And what they also found when they dug even deeper is that when churches that were predominantly white dropped to below 50% white, a lot of those white parishioners ended up leaving the church, because at that point it was like it was becoming too multiracial for them. Based on the study, this is what they picked up, their words, not mine, but that's what they found out. And they found that when Black people, even though they were more willing to enter these predominantly white spaces, they basically had to let go of their culture, their traditions, their, habits of worship or whatever. Like the typical Black church, as I said, we know tends to be more highly spirited. The preaching style is way more, typically speaking, passionate. Some people might venture to say it's too animated or whatever. That honestly boils down to personal choice, or personal preference. But history plays a big part in that, because again, if you're thinking about back in slave days when slaves had their own church and stuff, they were incorporating different practices from within their people group, from within their ancestry, from within the African culture. And so a lot of those things have stuck with the Black church, such as the cadence and the tune and the tone of singing and the choir and Negro spirituals and the way that pastors preach and stuff. And so what Mark, Mike, and Kevin found was that Black people had to forego those things, because even when they entered the predominantly white spaces, those kind of things were seen as lesser than. So if you saw a pastor that preached more passionately, like what we typically see in a Black church, that was deemed as not being reverent, or it was seen as not being true preaching, being a false preacher, or whatever the case may be. If there were choirs in the church, it was seen as too showy and too worldly, you know. And so a lot of Black people over time started to miss that. They started to miss that relatability and that communal sense of like, this is how we worship, you know, like observing your culture. Like I say all the time, I'm American born, but I'm first generation American. My parents are both from Guyana, South America. And there are certain things culturally that they're used to seeing that if they didn't see it over time, they would miss it. Doesn't mean that it's wrong, doesn't mean that it's sinful or bad, but it's just like, this is your culture. And I think that culture and diversity is such a beautiful thing, but I'm gonna dive more into that later and how I feel like the church just tends to have this colorblind kind of apathy towards racial issues. But again, I'll get to that later. But needless to say, the study showed that. And so when the study dug deeper and deeper, they saw, like I said, Black people were leaving in Black churches and going to white spaces more so than white people leaving white spaces and going to Black churches. And they also found that it was creating a divide over time, because while you're worshiping with these people and slowly but surely you're having to like let go of your culture, let go of like, you know, your worship style, let go of things that you grew to know and love or that you even prefer. Then you also have the looming rising of racial tensions happening sometimes in the church itself and other times just around you in the world. Because if it's not happening in the church, it's definitely happening in the world. And as we've seen in recent years, particularly since about 2011-ish or so, it's really started spiking up every year with these incidences of, you know, just different racial police brutality and profiling and things like that. So it's really just gotten like to a point where it's a little out of hand, and it's really unfortunate that all of these lives have suffered because of it. And it's been a very traumatic experience for a lot of Black people, because you're constantly seeing this. It's constantly like another one of us is going through this, another family is mourning a loss, another family is going through this, and we feel it as a community, you know what I'm saying? And so you're going through all this stuff, losing your own, you know, worship style and all that, like I said, but then you're also dealing with the looming rising of racial tensions, and you can't even bring it up in the church that you go to because it's not even addressed. You either typically see two responses when it comes to racial tensions in the church. Typically it's either defense mode, so defending like, well, this is why we don't do this is why we don't do that, this is why, you know, this is justified or this and that. And that goes back to slavery too. There are people like Bishop Elliot of Georgia who defended slavery and said that it was a great appointment and basically arrangement of God for slaves to hear about the gospel, and that God was like pleased with it. So you have people like that defend the wrongdoing and try to spin it to be some radical kind of like, you know, justice of God move kind of thing or whatever. And then you have the people that are very apathetic and are just like, you know, my job is to focus on Christ. Let's just focus on Christ. Let's focus on Jesus. Let's focus on heaven, and let's not talk about it. And both of those responses are damaging to Black people, because the first one is basically like, it's shifting all of the blame to the victim of the oppression, and it's taking away the wrongdoing of it and trying to romanticize it to say like, well, all of this is happening, but at least they're hearing the gospel, you know, like Bishop Elliot, you know, like, well, they're slaves, but at least they're hearing the gospel of Jesus. So slavery is a minute, you know, casualty of them hearing the gospel. And that's very toxic and draining and just problematic on so many levels. But then the apathetic approach, it's very damaging to Black people, because it's like, be quiet. Like basically it's like, stop talking about that. We don't want to hear it. Let's focus on Jesus. And the reality of the situation is, it's an uncomfortable conversation. Okay. I wasn't necessarily thrilled to come on here and talk about this, but I felt a pressing upon myself to talk about it. And it's not easy to hear, especially when you're on the side of history that is shameful, you know, and that could give you a bad look. Like nobody wants to be on the quote unquote wrong side of the story. So I get it. I get how it's uncomfortable, but it's a conversation that needs to be had, because every other issue that the church, you know, those hot button issues that the church speaks about all the time, they don't have a problem speaking about it. But as soon as it comes down to race, now it's okay, well, we don't need to talk about that. Let's just focus on Christ. Let's focus on heaven. You don't have that same energy when you're talking about the other issues. So it's like, you know what I'm saying? If we're going to talk about them, let's talk about them all. Let's bring them all to the table and let's address it, so that way we can really get to true healing, true reconciliation, reconciliation and not making people feel like, okay, well, I want to express what I'm going through, living this life in my skin. And so for me to do that makes me a bad person, you know? Like, let's actually get to the point where we can sit down, have the uncomfortable conversations so we can deepen the relationship. Because it's almost like when you're in a relationship or a marriage with someone and you guys have an argument, if you do the argument the right way, which it doesn't become like even more problematic and stuff after the fact, after that argument, after the storm clouds have passed, you guys are closer, you guys are bonding better, like you've reached a depth of your relationship that you weren't at yet before the argument. And so I feel like racial reconciliation is like that. We're so busy trying to make sure that we present a certain image, particularly in the church, where we want to seem like, yeah, see, we go to church together, we get along, we're from all tribes, all tongues, all nations, that we're sweeping the elephant in the room under the rug and we're not addressing it head on. And so you have a lot of surface level, frivolous and faux friendships where it's just all surface. It's all at the tip of the iceberg and never gets deep. And so for it to get deeper and for us to truly get to a place of healing, we got to sit down and have these uncomfortable conversations. And there's going to have to be some looking in the mirror. There's going to have to be some, you know what, I definitely have not been doing my part to speak up, or, you know, I have had some problematic ideologies that I didn't know about, or whatever the case may be. But when we have those conversations and we do it in a healthy and productive way, then slowly but surely, with each day, each month, each year, each generation, we can get to a place of being at reconciliation. We can get to a place of true reconciliation where it's like, you know what, we can really see what the issues are and we can do life together. And it's not like this underlying, like going along to get along and hiding things and whatnot. So with that being said, how has race affected the church today? I already talked about how the church is still largely segregated. About 84% of churches to this day are still either black church or white church. So that, as we see, has carried on from slavery all the way till now. But also race has affected the church in the sense that a lot of people in these multiracial churches just feel like race is not being adequately addressed, if addressed at all. It usually gets maybe one talking point, and that's it, and that's if you're lucky. But other than that, it's literally treated as if it doesn't exist. So going back to that apathy that I had mentioned earlier, where it's kind of like, let's just focus on Jesus, let's just focus on heaven. And while we do want to focus on eternity, we still have work to do on earth, and there are still things that we need to be paying attention to when things happen. A common thing that I hear a lot of black people say, whether they're in the church or not at this point, but maybe they used to be in the church if they're not anymore, is that, like I had mentioned earlier, that communal feeling, that way of like, when something happens, we all feel it in the community. So I remember I was listening to a live stream by Black Christian Influencers, which is an organization that I'm a part of. And they were doing this conversation on race relations in the church in 2020, I believe. And the lady that was speaking, I wish I could remember her name. I have her face in my head, but I can't remember her name. But that live stream was everything, y'all. Like, it was amazing. If I could find it on their Instagram page, I'll put it in the description box below so you could watch it if it's still up there. But it was so good. And she was saying how she had actually grown up in a neighborhood that was like all black for the most part, like black love, black joy, black pride, black affluence, black opulence, black influence, all of that. And I can relate because I grew up in PG County, Maryland. If you know anything about PG County, Maryland, it's the second wealthiest black county in the nation. And I resonate with everything that she said. Black love, black joy, black influence, affluence, opulence, the whole nine, you know? And she said that when she reached a point in her life that I think she was in her 20s, or maybe she was newly married. I can't remember the exact standpoint of when this happened. But she reached a point in her life where she kind of wanted to get away from all of the blackness of her neighborhood per se. And she wanted to just experience like the multiracial church, you know, and just multiracial living, like being in a truly diverse neighborhood, truly diverse church, so on and so forth. And she said she did find that there were some benefits to it, but she also found that the church was ill prepared for the multiracial agenda that they basically sought out after, I believe it was the late 90s. There was a book that was authored that was basically talking about like how churches need to be multiracial, and that started the whole campaign about like, oh, we got to go and seek people that are not like us, like seek those other ethnicities to join our church and stuff like that. And she said there were benefits to it. It wasn't all bad, but what she found was that a lot of times she was asked to do things that other people didn't want to do. She was like tasked with more of the hard work and stuff like that. And also there was just times where as a nation, Black people were grieving or, you know, suffering or whatever. And she just did not feel the support, the emotional support and understanding in those moments. And she specifically referenced when Trayvon had passed away. She said that that day that the news came out, which I remember this day, it was a very sad day, to be honest, because I was with my friends when the news came out. She said that it was just really sad, and she was glad that she was with her relatives at their church, which was a Black church, because that night the church came together and had like a prayer service, and people comforted each other and grieved and just, you know, prayed to God and sang hymns and the whole nine, you know. And she was like, I already knew my church wasn't going to do that. And so she was like, I was glad to not be at my home church, which was a multiracial church, but was, again, predominantly white. Like the stats say, even the multiracial churches tend to still be predominantly white. She was like, I was glad to not be there because I know that they wouldn't have been able to feel my pain and resonate with it. And so she was like, I was glad I was at the Black church. And I hear a lot of people say that. There's just instances in our community as Black people that it's like, I need to feel that comfort. I need to be around people that understand it. Again, what's understood doesn't need to be explained. They probably feel the same way as you, and so on and so forth. So I'm not saying all multiracial churches don't get it. I'm not saying none of that, but I'm just saying by and large, this is what I hear a lot of Black people saying, is that when they're in these multiracial spaces that say that they want the church to look like heaven and everyone to be represented and all this type of stuff, they just don't have the room for their Blackness to get past a certain point. Like at some point, you got to conform, you got to fit into their boxes that they want you to fit into, which more often than not tend to be more whitewashed. And so that's the problem. It's like a part of you is slowly but surely being shed off so that you can fit into these boxes and you can fit into what they deem as appropriate, you know, down to the way you speak, you know, how you worship, the whole nine. And so that is what I hear a resounding kind of conversation going on around. And I can honestly agree. You know, there were times where I personally wasn't members of these churches, but I might have visited and stuff. And there was just a general insensitivity to the feelings of Black people dealing with, you know, the news coming out of this happening and that happening and this racial uprising and this racial tension getting stronger and this and that, the third. It's like, it was so hush hush, like you couldn't talk about it. And the minute you talked about it, you were seen as like sinful, like, oh, you're looking too much to the world. You need to just focus on Jesus and this and that, the third. And honestly, that mindset is what started the whole Black exodus out of white church spaces. And I would say the Black exodus slowly but surely started around 2012 or so, but around 2015, 2016, because I remember I was either pregnant with my son or I just had him. Around that time, it really started amping up. Like you saw Black people leaving white church spaces in droves and either going back to the traditional Black church and realizing like, you know what? Just because they preach like this, that doesn't mean that they're ungodly. Just because we have a choir, that doesn't mean that it's ungodly or anything like that. Like, it's okay for me to be in this place. And honestly, the Black church has been the center of the community, the Black community, for so long. This is where we were taught our foundation. This is where we were clothed, where we were fed, where we could come and find solace and all that. So you found a lot of Black people leaving white church spaces to go back to the Black church, or they just honestly were leaving the church altogether and like, I'm done with Christianity altogether because whiteness just has a hold on it and I'm just not here for it. And again, that's another video for another day about the whole notion that Christianity is the white man's religion, but we're not gonna dive into that because honestly, I'll be here talking for the next 3 hours and that needs its own video segment, which might just be in the membership area when I get that up and running. We'll see. But nevertheless, it's just like, there's so many layers to this conversation that have led Black people to say, you know what? We're done with the multiracial church. We're just going to go back to the Black church, or we're just going to leave church altogether. And I think that that is a big part of it, not addressing these things when they come out, because it's like, again, there are hot button issues in the church that the minute it happens, they're talking about it, you know, whether that is human trafficking, whether it's abortion, whether it's, you know, the LGBTQ community, whatever it is. It's like, these are things that people talk about. They talk about it on the pulpit. They back initiatives, you know, that they believe in. Behind it, they do all these things. But the minute you bring up racial reconciliation in Black and white, it's like, oh, we got to focus on God. Let's not talk about that. It's uncomfortable. I get it, you know, and a lot of people that have to have this conversation, they're just their ancestors or whatever. Hey, I get it. Like, it's not something you're proud of, but at the end of the day, you got to have these conversations to have true, genuine relationship, because everybody that I've talked to, not everybody, let me not say that, but most Black people that I've talked to know that like there are certain things that are just off limits when you're in predominantly white spaces in the church, and there is a certain decorum that you're expected to exhibit across the board, and it goes deeper than just like basic manners, basic respect, things like that. Like I said, it's checking off the boxes and being culturally acceptable to what they deem as godliness. And if you don't fit those boxes, whether it's your preaching style, your singing style, your worship style, whatever, your lifestyle, within reason, then it's like you're not godly. And so Black people, a lot of them are just tired of that, and that's what's led them to say like, yeah, I'm done. So that has greatly affected the church. Also, the spiritual color blindness that exists in the church that I had alluded to earlier is another way that race has affected the church. And this is honestly another reason why a lot of people are leaving the church, which I will put a pin here and say that based on the research that I've done on Pew Research, I believe it was, Black people are still by and large a part of the church. So generally speaking, Black people still tend to be attached to Christianity or some religion of some sort. However, the ones that are leaving the church are increasing in number, and it's said that by 2050, the number of people attending church is going to be exponentially small, because a lot of people are just becoming unchurched Christians because of all of these things. Like, they still believe in God, they still acknowledge him, but they have no desire to be a part of a church body. That's becoming very common, very popular because of these things, and also other parts of church culture that can honestly be very toxic and misleading. Another video for another day, you already know. But the colorblind gospel thing and spiritual colorblindness is definitely a catalyst for people saying, I'm done with Christianity, because it gives the whole notion that once you're a Christian, you should only identify as Christian. So your ethnicity, your gender, all that other stuff goes out the window. And I get the sentiment behind it, because ultimately, me being a Black woman, me being a mother, me being all these things don't have eternal ramifications or eternal weight, in the sense of like, when I'm in heaven, that's what people are going to recognize me by. But it still is a part of my life today, and I can't negate the fact that I view life through the lens of a Black woman, because I'm navigating life through a Black body. I can't negate the fact that I navigate life as a mother, because I have a child, I have offspring. So there are certain things and points of views that I hold on to and that I experience and that I've witnessed because of these things. And I don't think that it's bad. Like, there's nothing wrong with diversity. There's nothing sinful about saying like, yes, I'm a Christian and I'm a proud Black woman. I'm proud to be Black. Like, there's nothing wrong with that. And people who hold on to this ideology of like, we shouldn't label ourselves anything but Christian, they tend to have that mindset of like, the minute you say you're anything but Christian, it's like you're putting more pride in that than Christ. I don't play about Jesus, period. Like, y'all that know me know I don't play about God. I don't play about my walk with God. However, I can have pride in the fact that I am part of this ethnic group. I have pride in the fact that my parents are of Caribbean descent. I have pride in the fact that I get to experience being a mother, and that's a blessing. I don't take it for granted, despite what the situation might look like. We all have things in our lives that we're proud about, and I don't think that that's bad. I think it becomes bad if you literally like center your whole life around that thing, or you use that thing as a way to weaponize it against other people. That's when it becomes bad. But if you just have like a healthy sense of like, yeah, like, I'm a Black woman, I'm a darker skinned Black woman, I'm proud of that, I'm proud to and blessed to be able to experience motherhood and stuff, like, it's like there's healthy pride and there's bad pride. And I feel like there's a healthy sense of pride that could come from that. And you don't have to be colorblind to be Christian. It's okay to acknowledge, yes, you're white and I'm Black, or I'm Black and, whatever the case may be. But it's not a bad thing. Like, God made us all different for a reason. And I think there's beauty in our differences. There's beauty in diversity. And we should learn to embrace it and not be so quick to be like, oh, no, let's ignore it. Like, don't even say it. Don't even reference it. Like, it's not a bad thing. God made us this way on purpose. And I think that the more that we embrace it, also the better it's going to be for racial reconciliation and us getting to that deep place of connection that I keep talking about, where it's like we're beyond just God is good all the time and saying all the Christianese and Christian colloquialisms and stuff, but where we could actually get real and raw and unfiltered and uncut and get to that hearty, deep friendship and relationships, I'm telling you, it's beautiful when you can get there, but it takes work. It takes self-awareness. It takes, compromise. It takes the whole nine. And if you're not willing to do that, then we're always going to just kind of be doing this Christian song and dance and living this Christian life and doing the Christian things, but never getting deep, never getting transparent, authentic, real, and raw. So we've talked about racial reconciliation, what it is, why it matters, and honestly, how race has affected the church to this day. So at this point, it's like, well, what are some practical tips for us to get to a place of racial reconciliation? And I have 3 tips for you that I think are just so simple, but yet so practical and just helpful and realistic. So first and foremost, if you are part of a multiracial church or a predominantly white church or space, create these spaces for Black people to be able to share their truths with you, whether that is a joyful truth and a triumph, whether that is a painful, oppressive truth, whatever the case may be, but where we can honestly just be real and vulnerable and like let our hair down and just say exactly what's on our hearts. And when you create these spaces, they don't have to be a space where you have to instantly have a solution or you have to jump into rebuking and all of that. Like, honestly, just listen. I feel like a lot of us have lost the art of just listening and hearing someone out and allowing them to grieve, allowing them to go through the process, allowing them to face all of the things that they've had to get through. Because also, which I already did a first video on this, but I'm gonna do a second video. A lot of Black people still do not have access to adequate mental health resources. And so that's another thing where it's easy to say, oh, go get therapy, go get therapy. A lot of us just don't have access to that. And so we're trying to process all of these things in life, all these microaggressions and macroaggressions and systematic oppression and all that, on a day-to-day on our own a lot of the time. And then we're trying to process it with other people also going through it, which does create a sense of community and bond and understanding. But it also is like, okay, I'm trying to help you while I'm trying to help myself type of thing. So if you're going to create these spaces and you genuinely want to, which I would encourage you all to, then be ready to listen. And you're going to have to hear some things that are uncomfortable. You're going to have to hear some things that might get you fired up inside, might rile you up and all of that. But if you truly desire to racially reconcile, this is a part of the process so that you can hear someone out and understand where they're coming from. Exhibit some empathy towards what Black people are saying. Like I always say, I'm blessed to have the gift of empathy, so that's not an area I necessarily struggle in. But if it is an area that you struggle in, pray and ask God to help you with that. Like, help me to see it through a lens where I can empathize with them and turn my heart away from things that might be hateful that I don't know about. I've been in predominantly white churches where the people loved me and my son and my family and all that. But when we got to talking and they would say certain things, I'm like, that is racist rhetoric. Like, that is something that is not healthy. That is something that is very problematic and discriminatory. But they didn't know that it was. Like, they genuinely just were ignorant to the fact that it was. And so it took an uncomfortable conversation to be like, yeah, you might not want to run with that idea. You might not want to run with that thought type of thing. So be ready for that. And before I move to tip number 2, let me just add and say that the reason why I say sit and listen is because I know for me, one of the most annoying things someone could do is when I come to them with a problem, they instantly just want to go off into a sermon and doing the most with, just trying to solve it and all that. Sometimes I really just want to vent and just get it off my chest. So just give people that space. Like, you should know and discern and pray for discernment if you don't know when they're ready to really hear solutions and work towards something. But give them space to just process it first and just listen to them, because I know for me that's really annoying. It's like, as soon as I come to you, you got 3 page PowerPoint presentation of that stuff that you're gonna say, and you preaching and going off, and it's like, wait a minute now, I just needed an ear. So I just wanted to say that. The second tip is to be intentional about learning about Black culture, the Black community, and even the Black church experience. I have heard one too many white people bashing the Black church experience and saying that it's not biblical, it's not biblically accurate, it's not biblically sound, and all this kind of stuff. But when you get down to it and you listen to the sermons and stuff, it's biblically sound. It's just that the preaching style is different, or they might not use certain rhetoric and certain words that are buzzwords and that you hear and you automatically associate it with biblically sound preaching. But that doesn't mean that it's inaccurate. The sentiment and the viewpoint is the same basically It's just a different delivery based on culture, bringing training, etc., because that's another conversation that has to be had about the fact that not all Black pastors have had a chance to go to these expensive seminaries and stuff. A lot of them have truly just been called and just started, their churches. And so that's another conversation. There's a lot of other conversations for another day in this video, but it's just, it is what it is, So educate yourself on Black culture. How did the Black church really form to what it is today? Why do we worship the way that we do? Why are there certain parts of our culture that we hold near and dear? Like, what does this mean? What's the significance? Like, educate yourself, because when you learn about something, like, you have a better empathy and sensitivity towards it, and you're able to better perceive, like, okay, yeah, like, this is good, and okay, I get this, okay, I didn't understand that, or whatever the case may be. So definitely commit yourself to learning and to being that person in your communities and in your church that can encourage other people to learn. Like, be willing to take a stand, be willing to say, like, yeah, like, we need to do better. And that might mean that you get some backlash, but at the end of the day, you shouldn't be so comfortable seeing injustices going on and you just turn a blind eye to it. Like, that is very problematic to me, especially if we are carrying the banner of Christianity. Like, we have a greater calling to weep with those who weep and to, bear each other's burdens and things of that nature. The third point, because I said I have 3, but I actually have 4. So the third point is to be intentionally and purposefully pursuing genuine experiences of Black people in your body of worship, in your church specifically, in general, but because we're talking about church and race, in the church specifically. So have Black people in leadership, integrate different worship styles, different worship songs. Like, you don't have to sing in the same cadence every week for it to be holy. Like, you can sing and worship in different ways, have representation in the materials in the church library, have resources where people can read books about Black culture and Black things that they need to know about, and how to integrate those things into the church and how to do life together better. There's so many more resources nowadays than there were 10, 20 years ago. So put helpful resources in the church library, in the church office, where people can get their hands on it more easily, and they can have it accessibly, and they can take it and use it to improve the church culture and the church life of that particular church, and honestly your neighborhood at large. So look for opportunities to where you can really incorporate Black culture and Black people, and it's not so much of a dynamic where, as I mentioned earlier, where it's Black people coming to white spaces and having to get in where they fit in and straighten up and fly right and fit their boxes in order to be accepted. Like, decolonize it all to where it's like, okay, we can sing in this way and still have a good worship and worship the Lord. We can preach in this style or have guest preachers come and still get a good word. Like, it doesn't always have to be monolithic in order for it to be holy and righteous. So decolonize it. Figure out ways that you can, incorporate different things if you truly are committed to this, if you truly are committed to having a diverse church that's not just superficially diverse in body, but is diverse in worship, in community, in life, and everything. The last tip that I have for you is to do a deep dive into any ideologies or just ways of thinking that you have that could be problematic. Because until you do that deep dive, you might not realize it's problematic. Now, if you need assistance with figuring that out, a good Google search goes a long way, or maybe just like have these conversations with a friend of yours who is Black and can help you and is willing to help you navigate it. But honestly, that's important because, like I had mentioned earlier, I've been in spaces where people didn't realize that they had rhetoric and ideologies and ways of thinking and beliefs that were very discriminatory and racist and just problematic all around. So definitely challenge yourself with that. Like I said, if you have someone who's willing to help you who's Black, then that's cool. But honestly, like, the onus really isn't on them to help you. But at the same time, if they are willing to help you, then hey, like, take advantage of that. But a Google search goes a long way, and just really challenging some things that within your gut it probably is problematic, but maybe you're like, I don't know, Google it, check it out, and just, work on developing a better, fair, and just way of thinking and viewing the world. So I'm gonna wrap up the video here because honestly, this is a hefty topic and I could keep going, but I'm gonna stop right here. Hopefully you guys got what I was saying, because this was definitely more off of the dome and just some things that were on my heart to share. So I hope that you got what I was saying and it wasn't all over the place. But either way, let me know down below, what are some ideas that you have to work towards racial reconciliation in the church particularly, but just in general. You know, have you felt like there's been more of a divide this year, or has there been like more reconciliation happening? Let me know your thoughts down below. As always, keep it respectful, keep it cordial, and keep it real. Like, just share your experiences, share your thoughts. Don't forget to like this video if you made it this far, and subscribe so you don't miss future videos, and I will see you on the next one.